As Richard said, we'll move seamlessly to the next panel, which is exciting because, as you see, the flow that the Alliance for Corporate Transparency has created for the day has brought us through all that, first of all, the political statements, then the analysis, through to then the political stage that was just described in terms of how is all this going to be developed. And now you come to obviously the most exciting panel of all, beyond belief, which is where you must take out your pencils and sharpen them, because this is the piece where we actually discuss the how and the what of what the revision of the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, or indeed the Sustainability Reporting Directive, might look like. And we have with us some real experts in this issue of developing the fundamental indicators and criteria, the most powerful indicators and criteria that need to be in the revision of Executive Vice President Dombrovskis's revision, to ensure that this becomes so much more powerful than the results that we saw this morning. And so let me introduce your stellar guests. First of all, we've got Eleni Choidas, Senior Policy Advisor at ShareAction, who many of you will know has been doing a workplace disclosure project which focuses in on key indicators regarding labour rights. We have Michael Zimonyi, the Policy and External Affairs Director at the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. Need I say more in terms of its relevance to this debate? We have Mirjam Wolfrum, who's the Director of Policy Engagement at the Carbon Disclosure Project for Europe. And we also have Bastian, who's the Chief of Standards at the Global Reporting Initiative. So you can see from their backgrounds that each of them has an extraordinary wealth and depth of experience about how to choose the most powerful indicators that will actually make that next revision of the Non-Financial Reporting Directive as powerful as we can possibly make it. So without further ado, I'd like to just say a little bit about the structure. So the structure is we're going to have 20 minutes really focused with Eleni and Michael. Then we'll have 20 minutes with Mirjam and Bastian. And then there'll be also about 20 minutes for questions from you, if I'm strict enough and the panel are disciplined enough, obviously. So there goes our name tags. So without further ado, let me just start really by going to Eleni and Michael, and just asking you really, given the results of this second assessment that we've had, from your perspective of developing indicators that drive change in key business sectors, what would you say are the fundamental lessons that you'd like the Executive Vice President Dombrovskis and his cabinet and DG to take up? So let's start with you, Eleni, if I may.
Yes, thank you very much. It's on. I'm not sure if I'm an indicator expert. I'm a loudly EU policy professional, but I will try very much to rise to the occasion. So thank you very much for the invitation here today. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I want to give you a little bit of background on the Workforce Disclosure Initiative, which is the reporting framework that ShareAction has been using to measure employee and social and employee-related matters, as outlined in the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. So the WDI is a survey. It's a corporate reporting framework developed by ShareAction and currently backed by a coalition of 135 institutional investors with over $13.5 trillion in assets under management, which we use to globally survey companies on workforce management. So on issues of the workforce composition, on workforce diversity, on supply chain structure and relationships, as well as issues such as development and training opportunities, etc. Thank you. So even if the overall work of the Alliance is not really meant to be a benchmark for what investors should and should not be reporting with, our perspective is very much led by our investor signatories, and it is very much meant to try and, within the context of the work of the Alliance, to highlight some key areas where we see a dissonance between the amount of investor demand for certain amounts of material information, and at the same time, the lack of company supply for that particular information. So this is our core perspective here today. So within this framework, I would like to just emphasize two key thematic areas that we have noticed in the topic of social and employee-related matters. And again, they are vast, but if we are going to be discussing topics that we think should be addressed at a granular level in the directive, these would be it. The first one concerns pay and wages. Now, a lot of you perhaps from the investment community or even who are working on standard setting and reporting will know that information on pay disparity and pay ratio is a key reflection of how a company is positioning themselves vis-a-vis the mitigation of ESG impacts and risks. For our investor signatories, this is a very significant issue that is meant to really show how companies are positioned to deal with the systemic risks within the societies they're operating in, and particularly if they're exposed to issues like social inequality or anything that can really undermine the longevity of the health of the society that they're operating in order for their business model to continue operating. So within the topic of pay and wages, what we notice in particular are the difficulties that companies have in terms of reporting against living wages, minimum wages, and fair wages. Now, out of the companies that we survey, only 39% are able to give an indication of how their ability to guarantee a living wage for their lowest paid workers. And then at the same time, the ones that do report are then very confused by what is the living wage versus a minimum wage versus a fair wage, which is a very, very different topic and three very different issues that need to be dealt with, we believe, separately in the review of the directive. The second issue is pay ratios. And perhaps for those of you who are active in shareholder activism or who do work around AGMs, you will have known that in the last couple of AGM seasons, we have seen an unprecedented amount of rejection of pay packages by key European investors, not so much on the US side, which is a clear indication that this is becoming an increasingly important source of risk, be it reputational risk, for companies and the investors that invest in them. But this is continues to be a very low priority in terms of the companies that are reporting. So this is something we would also very much emphasize we need to see in the directive. And then quickly to the second area, which are contingent workers. So contingent workers are workers that are not on permanent contracts, so workers that are freelancers, consultants who are hired on a per project basis, et cetera. We find that, of course, depending on the company and the country of operations, there is always some level of reporting for these worker segments. But it is important to note that considering that is an especially vulnerable worker segment, it is very worrying to see that even when companies are able to report on the percentage of contingent versus permanent staff that they have, they're very rarely able to provide or willing to provide further information on how the content of the work and the overall, let's say, risk profile of the job differs between these different kinds of contracts. And they are definitely not able to account for different forms of, for the lack, let's say, of evolution between these contracts, or why would contracts remain the same, why would they evolve, et cetera. I have more to say, but I will keep it at that.
Thanks very much, Eleni. That's very helpful. And I think you have highlighted two fundamental risk areas. Obviously, pay and wages being fundamental to people, to the whole issue of equality. but also to the extraordinary nature of human rights, and particularly to women's human rights in terms of a living wage, which is probably the most important facilitating labour right that they can have. But then again, this issue of the gig economy being so prevalent across Europe, as we heard from Lara Walters, MEP, but also across so many industries and so many supply chains in Europe. So thanks very much. Michael, can I come to you again with a similar question? From your perspective, how do you, what are your reflections in terms of the fundamental criteria and indicators that you'd want to see put into this non-financial reporting directive to make it as powerful as we possibly can in the next generation?
Sure. Thank you very much, Phil, for the question, and thank you very much for the Alliance for organizing this excellent event. Just before I start, a very quick introduction to CDSB, if I may. We're a consortium of business and environmental NGOs set up in 2007 at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting. And our mission is really the integration of climate change and natural capital information into mainstream reporting, making the links between the financial and other information in annual reports, as well as the so-called sustainability, ESG, non-financial, what have you, information, really linking those together, both from the financial reporting side and the environmental reporting side of things. So we do this through a framework, which really is a collection of these ideas. What we have done in preparation for this upcoming review of the Non-Financial Reporting Directive is to come up with a proposed set of red lines from our perspective, which is on our website, and we're actively seeking comments. This is an evolving document, and I'd love to talk to you about these. What we have taken a focus on the climate and environmental elements, and also very much looking at the mainstream finance perspective to make sure that we scale this up, because the idea really here is not just reporting for reporting's sake, but actual action and decision-making on based on this information. So in this perspective, it's important to look at how a mainstream investor would look at this information and what would make it useful for their decision-making. And with this in mind, our key point is to make sure that this information makes it in the management report, in the annual report of a company. Now, we've seen from this research that 57.5% of the companies reviewed do that. Great. The rest is somewhere else, and this makes it extremely difficult in some cases to find this information. There's some great information out there. There are some standard places of reporting, like the CDP questionnaire, for example, great. But we often, and we spend our time reading reports, way too many reports. It's embarrassing to say, but even we find it difficult sometimes to find the information, and often it is there, but we just can't find it. It also then lacks the connection between financial performance and the climate change and environmental matters that are disclosed. And this is really the reason behind the TCFD's existence. They wanted to see the financial impact, the financial risks behind this information. And if we want to break through to the mainstream market, we need to speak their language. We need to talk about, of course, we need to talk about the impacts, both sides of the coin, both the impact of the business on the environment and the impact of the environment on the business. But we need to explain what our impact as a business means to the future ability of a company to create value. It's so important to make sure that this is picked up at scale. Second, we have, of course, started with a pragmatic approach and limited the requirement to companies with over 500 employees. They have the most resources to comply with this. But it's clear that the number of employees is not it's not the best way of understanding where the impacts, the dependencies are. And it's often linked much more to the activities of a company rather than the size of a company, so to speak. So it's important that we've tested it, it works. We have companies saying we want more, which is great. Now we need to expand this to the 250 level at least. That is actually the context of the accounting directive, which hosts this directive. This is already the case in Sweden. We see companies reporting, not so badly actually, and it's important that we scale up and get the information. And the quote, I think it was Philip who mentioned that if an investor looks at this information and only sees a part of their portfolio having this information, how can you make a decision across your portfolio? Last is a specific deep dive on some of the metrics and is really the point around the TCFD itself. It has emerged as generally accepted practice, not just in Europe, but across the world. It pushes the discussion further, and the Commission has already provided non-binding guidelines with the help of the technical expert group. It's time to now really incorporate it inside the directive itself to bring that information to those investors in a way that they can do it. And frankly, the TCFD only focuses on climate, but a lot of the thinking, the principles, the approaches behind it can be applied much more widely. There is great work also being made around expanding the thinking to not just climate change, but natural capital, biodiversity. Let's start this process. Let's be leaders in Europe and push it ahead. So, very last point. Sorry for taking so long. We talked about, the requirements themselves are not the end of it. We talked about due diligence. Another important element is enforcement. We have financial supervisors supervising information in management reports. This is why it's also important that this information makes its way in the management report. But those supervisors, very few are actually looking at so-called non-financial information. The UK has just announced that it will do. France has already done so. The Dutch were the first in Europe to look at reviewing this information. This is such an important authoritative feedback loop. It's not about cease-to-trade notices. It's not always about punishing companies. It's about having authoritative feedback so that companies know exactly what is expected of them. And this is so important. So I just wanted to make that point as well.
Great, thank you very much. So just a couple of follow-up questions from me. Eleni, I suppose you spoke particularly about this issue of living wage, fair wage. Have you looked at the way in which that could be made into a form of directive question, a set of indicators that might be powerful to absorb there into the structure?
So in terms of the theme of living and fair wage, I would be very hesitant to say this is the exact way to do it. But in terms of an overall structure for what will hopefully be the regulation, the Sustainability Reporting Regulation, I think that we would very much agree with the approach characterized by Eleni on the double the double materiality is in the directive, but the possibility of having minimum mandatory reporting requirements on this issue very particularly, which can then be supplemented by further information by corporates should they deem it material. We think that this amount of flexibility is very important in trying to find a balance between a very principles-based and a very prescriptive approach. Now, in terms of the living wage in particular, and the fair wage in particular, one of the key topics is to ensure that companies are able to understand and to articulate what is a minimum wage and what do they consider being a minimum wage and a living wage, which can then really allow for the correct assessment of the data that they disclose. But connected to that, I just wanted to quickly mention a couple of overall principles which have been mentioned already by now, by the end of the day, in terms of any kind of indicators that should be put in this revised regulation, and including in the minimum reporting approach with an additional discretionary reporting approach. The first one is the supply chain transparency. So not just an issue of living wage, fair wage, or contingent workers that I mentioned before, but across the board in all of the themes that we're looking at, companies are significantly underreporting on these issues throughout their supply chain rather than in their direct operations. So we think this is something that needs to be clearly reflected in mandatory reporting requirements. The second issue is to procure data at a disaggregated level. This means data on workforce and social and employee-related issues that are able to be analyzed at the level of gender, age, religious beliefs, sometimes sexual orientation, depending on the operating community. This is actually one of the key points that our investor signatories keep making, and it is very much much more difficult to find this kind of information. So we need to ensure that the regulation does incentivize it.
Yeah.
The third one is, and I just have two more, is, again, the issue has been mentioned ad nauseum by now, and I think also in the previous panel when reflecting a bit on the challenges of reporting on human rights issues, is the idea of process versus impact. So clearly, it is very important to be reporting on process. So let's not say that, you know, focusing on process is a bad thing. Focusing only on process definitely is, but there has to be definitely let's say, an incentive across these different indicators that would allow for a seamless transition from how the company is approaching social and employee-related matters within the different processes, and then those impacts directly. But both are part of the same continuum.
Great.
And I think I'm going to leave it there. I have more, but I know that you're anxious.
Yep, there'll be lots of questions from the audience too. I'm anxious to get to the audience when we can. I'm just going to have one, if I may, one question to you, Michael. I suppose it is on that issue of targets. I saw you nodding vigorously. I mean, to this issue of process and impact, process and targets, do you and that forward-looking issue that came out very strongly in the previous panel, how do you see those impact issues and the forward-looking nature and the targets issues being better represented in the next iteration of the directive?
It's extremely crucial. A good example, for example, another example of where processes are ruling the world is around governance. And if you look at a lot of the disclosures made this year around governance, it's all about the governance standards that companies implement rather than who's actually in charge of things, what are we doing, how are we doing against them. When we look at the target setting, the KPIs, there's still a lot of different ways of reporting, and it's I think what is incredibly important is for those sectors, for those companies that have similar activities to come together and start thinking about. There are, we need to come up with some sort of comparability. Yes, there are some commonly used metrics within each sector, but even within sectors, we don't have those clear KPIs that really just are generally accepted. So it's incredibly important to do that. Whether there's something we can do in the directive about it, that would be an interesting debate to discuss. I enjoyed your comments, Sebastian, as well, around going down to that sector specificity. My biggest concern is how do we do this? There's a Danish saying, we need to go quickly, slowly. We don't have time. This is an incredibly immense challenge. How do we do all of this? How do we review the directive? How do we come up with sector-specific KPIs? How do we do this now? Because we don't have time. We need to really, really scale up. It's not impossible, but we need to really get started with it. And this year has to be the year of getting this done. There's not much time.
So we have a new dance, the sustainability waltz, which will be quick, and slow. Over to Eleni, very quickly, because I must move to the others.
Very quickly. I just wanted to say, to just make a couple of more points concerning the specificity of human rights issues or social and employee-related matters, as we say in this case. Clearly, we don't have a TCFD for social and employee-related matters that we can say, let's take it and let's just integrate it into this new regulation. So the approach has to be a little more timid. It has to be a little bit more trial and error as we go on. Nonetheless, I think that there are a number of different forces happening currently within the sustainable finance agenda around the issues of human rights that need to be fully aligned with the development of any potential minimum mandatory indicators. The first ones could potentially be the social safeguards of the taxonomy, which will themselves be based on the do no significant harm criteria of the disclosure regulation. For those of you who follow these issues are aware of this particular topic. So this is just a mention to say that we need to absolutely ensure that there has to be a seamless or very close approximation between what companies are asked to report on what investors will find useful in the context of using the taxonomy, or when companies in themselves assessing whether they are compliant with the minimum safeguards of the taxonomy. And then what, then fully speaking about the requirements under the disclosure regulation, what investors will find useful for themselves to be able to fulfill their own requirements under the disclosure regulation. So there has to be a lot of thinking around how to do this.
No, I'm going to come back.
Okay.
We're running out of time, and I want to keep to time as much as I can, but I'm sure there'll be opportunities to mention the other things. So thanks for your patience. I'm now going to come to Mirjam and Bastian. So could I start with you, Mirjam, and just ask you the same question, really, I started with the others, which is, from your experience, really, in terms of the Carbon Disclosure Project in Europe, what would you say were the key lessons that you'd want to ensure were inserted and understood inside the revised directive to enhance its overall impact on corporate behaviour and investor behaviour?
Yes, happy to do that. Carbon Disclosure Project is a formal name. I have to insist on that because, again, I talk about emissions a lot, but I will also talk about other environmental issues. So it's actually just CDP. Maybe also 2 sentences on what CDP's work is. Just to put you, because again, I give you a number of figures, and so you can kind of, put this into the context of our scope of work. So CDP is a disclosure system for corporates, also cities and regions, but today we talk about corporates, and it is on climate and environmental information, and the system works with the authority of investors. It's investors in that representing assets globally of 96 trillion, and in Europe it's actually 41 trillion. And in terms of the companies using that system to disclose to their investors, it's more than 8,000 globally and more than 2,300 companies in Europe. This is not only listed companies, it's also non-listed companies, basically the supplier companies, so to say. And last not least, I'd like to start also on one word on why I do believe that Europe has indeed a very specific momentum here. When we just look into the disclosures of the European companies, we can see that across the score CDP releases every year, we have in the so-called A list, which is the companies leading on climate and environmental issues, we see 44% of companies in Europe scoring an A compared to global levels. So there is definitely we can really take the steps in Europe now and take things further. And on the 2 or 3 issues that you'd like me to take, to mention here, I think there's many, but I'd like to probably insist on another point that has already been raised many times today. There is targets and there is disclosure through entire supply chains that I'd like to talk to you about today. We see still a lack of quality and quantity of data, although also well noted that we don't just need any type of more data just for the sake of data. It needs to be relevant material information, and we need entire supply chain disclosures. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions and emission targets, we are still flying pretty blind. That is just a reality. Even after 20 years of voluntary disclosures through CDP and to other networks, we still have huge gaps on that. And this is also, GHG emissions is the most mature, let's say, element of everything we have heard today, right? You will remember that we had other issues, natural resources is even worse in terms of disclosure. We're talking about the most mature issue in terms of metrics, methodologies, and disclosure, and we are still not where we need to be to ensure that we can deliver the European Green Deal. And this also relates to, obviously, disclosure and through entire supply chains, because we need to see scope 1, 2, and 3 disclosures in order to move forward. Should I continue to two more sentences? Two more sentences. Okay. All right. So the benefit of this is also basically what we need to see in the review of the NFRD, in the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, is definitely to include specific disclosure requirements relating to corporate greenhouse gas emissions targets, including scope 3, which means that this needs to cover all indirect and direct emissions that occur in the value chain. And this better disclosure of GHG emission targets by European companies will probably have multiple benefits. Also, for example, just strengthening the disclosure under the taxonomy regulation. And just one sentence on beyond climate. I'm talking about emissions today, giving you a lot of numbers about this, but there is also, we need to use that and to look into other environmental elements. There is a work underway to develop science-based freshwater targets and science-based forests targets, and we can just now think about what is mature enough to really roll it out, but this cannot stop here at all, also not in terms of the regulation.
Thank you very much. That's great. And Bastian, obviously you've got a wide perspective in terms of the Global Reporting Initiative. And sorry about the CDP. I'm terrible. I have a nervous tick to any acronyms, so I always say the words, so apologies. But the Global Reporting Initiative, or also GRI, is known very much for that breadth of experience. So could you tell us from that breadth, what you see as the fundamental, the three most important things that you'd want to see transferred from that experience into the next iteration of the directive?
Well, also from me, thank you for the invitation and great to be here. I will try to build a bit on what the colleagues have said and also maybe build on the legacy of the work that GRI and others have done in this reporting space, in the voluntary reporting space. So what we see as really paramount at this point in time is that we acknowledge the international authoritative instruments that exist actually across the board of the issues that you discuss under the Sustainable Development Agenda. And that's obviously things like the Paris Accord, that's the SDG agenda if you look at ambition. But there are things that exist for much longer that are currently not actually acknowledged in corporate reporting on sustainability issues, like the ILO conventions, for example, right? Or now, almost 10 years old, the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. We see that these things are still not structurally acknowledged as the norm that you perform against as a corporate. And if there's one thing we learned from the standard setting efforts in the last years, that it is very, very important to start with the acknowledgement of the responsibility and then move to targets and goals. I think Mirjam just explained that. It doesn't make sense to have climate change related reporting without a clear articulation of how goals are set against the Paris Accord, right? And you can declinate that through for any, whether environmental or social issue in what we're trying to aspire to with the sustainable development notion. Targets and goals then connected to narrative reporting. As much as we all, or maybe some of us, want quantification of issues, there is a narrative reporting component that is absolutely needed. And if you want to see that at play, go to financial reporting. Most of the financial reporting information is relatively useful without the commentary. So there is, in corporate reporting, absolutely the need to explain quantified metrics that we try to go for in most of the arenas. And it is really the sequence of considerations that needs to be carried through for all the topics that we're looking at. Is there an international norm? Is there maybe going forward for the EU context a EU ambition that has been formulated for corporate performance? How does the organization's business model relate to that? Does the organization actually commit to being in line with that norm? And then declinating through what related targets and goals are, how you organize your management approach and how you understand the impact. I think that was an important point in the discussion today, that oftentimes what is missing from the reporting is actually an articulation of what the exact impact is, right? And I think when it comes to metrics, I think there are 2 points. One is, we are very cautious with saying that there are sector-specific metrics. There are certainly sector-specific themes and likely material subjects per sector. But whether the metrics are indeed very sector-specific, that remains to be seen for very many of the issues. I give you one example. We've just recently launched the first global standard for corporate tax reporting. promoting the idea that was also a bit in the research today, public country-by-country reporting by multinational corporations. And the set of information that you prescribe is the same across all sectors, right? The information request is the same for all sectors. It is also, interestingly enough, the same for all stakeholder groups. Irrespective of whether you sit on the civil society side of the equation or you're an investor, in the end, we were able to identify one set of information that serves these purposes, right? So, and maybe that's the comment then in relation to materiality. I think the dual materiality approach is excellent. I think it took very many years to actually argue the case for it, that it is now there and embraced is very important. But in relation to that as well, the general observation going forward needs to be, from our perspective, that without a proper understanding of the impacts on others, you cannot possibly articulate most of the financial risks arising from sustainability issues. And the TCFD is a good example. 80 to 90% of what's in the TCFD is a reconfirmation of the good work of the colleagues at CDP, the WRI, and WBCSD GHG protocol. So we've been reconfirming metrics that have been in existence for a long time, arguably not reported well, but the metrics we have, right? And building this out, that's where we need to lay an emphasis now.
Thank you. That's excellent. And again, you know, that emphasis on international standards and the means of bringing those in and the simplification, therefore, for many companies, investors, I think is a really important point. So, Mirjam, I'm going to come back to you with really a question. Again, you mentioned right at the end this issue of development of science-based targets around other planetary boundaries than climates, for instance, on forestry and on fresh water. Do you? I mean, first of all, are you seeing the means by are you able to describe the kind of what and the how of that at the moment? Are you seeing indicators coming through, and are there perhaps international indicators that have already been developed on that?
Yes, the science-based target, science-based emissions reduction targets is indeed a work that I'm happy to emphasize because it's the most advanced, I think, methodology available. It's a joint initiative of WWF with the World Resources Institute, UN Global Compact, and CDP, and I hope I didn't forget anyone. And it's really sort of the approach to set, when a corporate sets a greenhouse gas emission reduction target, that this is based on science. And by science, we mean, or we meant 2.0 degree, and now we mean 1.5. And I hope this is not going to go to 1 degree, but this could be the case. So basically, based on science means based on latest IPCC research. Science-based targets provide companies with a clearly defined pathway to future-proof growth by specifying the how much and how quickly they need to reduce their GHG emissions. So it means that a company setting a science-based targets under this initiative or with the support of that initiative discloses a full GHG emissions inventory, so scope 1, 2, and 3, along with detailed target information, and set ambitious medium targets that lead to absolute emission reductions. And we do have a number of, so this is the idea of science-based targets is clearly to be able to measure and track against the Paris Agreement. And it's done by sort of measuring back. And we do have, in terms of numbers, now there is commitment to science-based targets, which doesn't yet mean to be approved. It usually takes companies 1 to 2 years to get approval. We do have now 321 companies with an approved science-based targets, whereof 155 are based in Europe. That's quite a substantial increase also of the uptake of the initiative. It has started with 0 a couple of years ago, and it's quite a very good success story. And in terms of the 1.5, the Science-Based Targets Initiative started on 2 degrees, and we now have 57 out of 90 companies with an approved 1.5 target as well, being European. So there is a lot. This is the concrete things that we probably need to see in regulation, because they are absolutely key to be able to measure against the achievement of the Paris Agreement. Again, as I said, if not, we probably just don't know exactly where we stand, and we do not have the time to not deliver concrete information to policy making to then, adjust policies.
And do you see similar science-based targets achievable in the relatively short term, enough for the directive, for instance, in areas like water and forestry that you mentioned, or is that still some way off, just in terms of these fundamental issues of planetary boundaries that we have to be alert to in terms of fresh water, for instance?
I would love to be able to answer your question. I'm afraid I'm not 100%. There's work done, and I think it can be incentivized, it can be strengthened. It can probably also be more funded, I guess. It's always a bit. But the point is, there is thinking, and all hands on deck. I think this could be done in due time to, have it already in the regulation, and then to allow for through delegated acts, or to come in somewhat a couple of years later. But I think it's crucial to take this into account, that it needs to be science-based with this planetary boundary concept.
Yeah, thank you. And so I'm going to be coming to you straight after this question. So get your minds ticking about what are the key questions that you want to ask the panel regarding these issues of the key and most powerful indicators. But Bastian, let me just come back to you for a final question from me. You mentioned, for instance, and I think it's so important that the Global Reporting Initiative has made a major effort to not reinvent the wheel, but to actually bring in so many of these agreed international norms and standards, from the UN Guiding Principles to the ILO conventions to the Paris Accord, etc. Do you believe that first of all, in terms of the ways in which the Non-Financial Reporting Directive can be strengthened in that manner, where would you say there are real opportunities for that to happen, in terms of the ones that really need to be much better considered in the next generation? And secondly, I suppose, how would we ensure that that was also complemented with this key issue about building in the targets? Because in many ways they don't necessarily build in the targets, but they do build in those international standards and norms which are so fundamental.
Well, I think it's really difficult to pinpoint just one of these instruments, right? I think the main point is that there is a lot more in terms of articulating responsibilities of corporates than the reports that have been reviewed seem to suggest, right? This is not happening in a vacuum. There have been discussions on the international level, on the EU level, regarding responsibilities of corporates for very many years, and we need to connect that back into the practice that we're discussing. But a specific field, I think where we are currently doing work and also trying to consolidate a bit the good practice that is emerging with leaders is in human rights reporting, right? We have the UN Guiding Principles. There's a very clear set of expectations enshrined in this norm. And we have to bring that back to the realities of the companies. I think what we've heard about the due diligence related work that's happening on the EU level, it's happening importantly, I think, also on the OECD level. That is what we need to connect to. So an expectation to actually perform the due diligence and make that a mainstay of corporate activity on an ongoing basis across the different issues. I think there is an extension also. This applies across the board to all issues under sustainable development. And that will be a big step forward. Currently, we're oftentimes faced when a reporting requirement is put out around due diligence, the response is, we don't have that, right? So this is where regulators can come in and can set expectations. I think that will also facilitate the work of very many colleagues within corporates that are actually trying hard to get this institutionalized within their own organizations. And so focus on the due diligence and the responsibilities from the international norms that arise for corporates and pointing out the relationships that the corporate from its perspective has with these norms, that's the way forward. But arguably, and I think the work that many of us have done in relation to transparency on human rights is a really good case study for this. It takes more than probably the standard and a norm on an international level. There is a link that actually, well, there are carrots and there's sticks, right? And the stick is missing here. And I think this is where the EU can come in and formulate expectations. I think we're seeing that. But for reporting to be a tool to show year-on-year performance and actually also performance towards a clearly set target, there are also regulatory interventions needed that maybe fall outside something that describes a reporting standard. But there is a very important interplay, as the colleague from WWF said earlier.
Great. I mean, that's so important from my perspective, just seeing as we do these kind of results being replicated in a whole set of benchmarks in my area, which is the business and human rights area. Again, these almost identical patterns, of a very large number of companies simply not reporting or reporting in a way which is cursory, and then a leadership group, a small but very important leadership group that's demonstrating the power of voluntary action, but is incapable of driving a race to the top amongst the rest, and a small catch-up group that really wants to also get up to that level of standard. So again, there's that issue of enforcement, as you said, Eleni, as well as the issue of the stick, as you described it more brutally, Bastian. And I was just struck by a conversation with John Ruggie, who is was the author of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, who always advocated a smart mix of voluntary and mandatory work. And he said at a conference here in Brussels in December, the problem is that we've never had a smart mix. We've just had the voluntary side of it. So bringing in that regulatory side, he was speaking particularly about due diligence, was fundamentally important in terms of the achievement of the guiding principles. But let me not go on too long because I'm occupying your time. So who'd like to ask some questions to the panel? Can I see hands, please? Don't be shy. Oh, thank you very much. That's one there. And I'd like to take clusters of 3. Can I also ask Philip or somebody just to tell me how long we have? Because we started 20 minutes over, but I just don't want to overrun too much. So, please.
Thank you for giving me the floor. Elisabeth Gambert from AFEP, that's the Association of Large French Companies. So I would like to give the view of our members who are the large, multinationals, 115, who have been obviously reporting for the last 15 years. So with Sebastian, I agree. I'm quite disappointed by the results. I will have a look at the geographical ventilation and the French performance, and also the performance of large versus smaller companies, because I would have expected us to be better. But that's my first comment. The second was on KPIs. That was a finding which was very much put forward as a key finding. We have been, just to give you an example, applying the duty of vigilance law in France for the last 2 years, and it is very difficult for companies to find the KPIs that are really reflecting the due diligence policies they are putting in place. Is it the number of audits performed? Is it the number of breaches observed with the contractors and so on? It's really a very tough issue, and it cannot be expected to be resolved in a very short amount of time, since the NFRD has been implemented in several member states. And what I really want to say is this panel is a very good illustration of the immense task that is in front of companies, which have to, which are confronted with all these initiatives, which are individually taken very, very interesting, legitimate, important. But just put yourself in in the position of a company which has to comply, in the French case, with numerous national legislations. And if you complain as investors about the amount of information that is out there, sometimes it's also information that we are asked to be published, that we are asked to publish, sorry. And we have published a report in AFEP about the, superposition of many legislative obligations that are duplicating, that are about the same issue but not exactly the same definitions. So my question to you is, how do you expect to work together? I know there's the Global Reporting Initiative, the Global Reporting Dialogue, trying to find a basis for you all to come forward with one questionnaire, basically, because this cannot go on, that we are confronted with hundreds of questionnaires which take, in some cases, 2-3 months of a single person just answering questionnaires. So please tell us how we can go forward with this question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have a question right next door. Thank you very much. And any other questions? And one there. Thank you.
Hi, Mairead Keir. I work for an organisation called Shift. I think you mentioned it earlier, Phil. And I really just wanted to make a comment, kind of building on something that Bastian mentioned there. But I think it's really important to stress, because we have also spent quite a number of years analysing companies' human rights reporting, and only human rights. And we came to the very similar conclusions as this initiative here, which we are we're involved in this initiative, Shift is involved in this initiative, which is that the majority of the largest companies do not report meaningfully on human rights. And we've gone back and forth on what this means and why it could possibly be. And our conclusion is that the starting point for companies when it comes to human rights is not correct. A lot of companies fail to think about risks to people. They start at risks to business. Where are these issues that are going to impact on us? Instead of risks to people, where is our value chain impacting on people? Who are these people? What are these specific impacts? And then that would lead to discussions about what actions they're taking. It would lead to discussions about what KPIs they attach to it, how they track them, and how they report them. Then it would also lead them to think about how they report on sustainable development goals, because the sustainable development goals are so inherently linked to human rights. About 70% of them connect to human rights. So the starting point is the key element when it comes to human rights disclosure. And my request would be for this review or revision of the NFRD, that when it comes to human rights, very, very clearly indicate that companies need to think about risks to people. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was another question over here, and I've been told we've only got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to take a series of 6 questions. Very bold. It's not you, but the man behind him, and then I'll come to you. He was first.
Hi there, Dave Cook from 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. So my question is pretty short, actually. It's, given the raft of sustainable finance type regulation we saw at the end of last year, the disclosure regulation, to name the taxonomy regulation, all of that, what sort of needs to happen in relation to the Non-Financial Reporting Directive to make sure that it mirrors that, supports that, and sort of goes to what I think Eleni was going to talk about in relation to a sort of happy correspondence of what companies are asked to report, what investors actually need, and what investors are now obliged to report on themselves.
Thank you. Could you pass it just forward?
Oh, I can use mine.
Oh, right. Sorry, forgot. I'm not used to having everybody with a microphone. Please go ahead.
No problem. Donato Calaccio again. So thank you for sharing all the insights. It's very, very interesting. A lot of the recommendations you made for policy are around transparency and disclosure. And I get it, because this is a regulation about reporting. But there is also an ambition behind this policy initiative, which is transformational accounting, changing the behaviors, not only increasing the level of transparency. So to what extent you believe that policy has a role in terms of promoting the use also internally in the companies of this data. In other terms, should we just put the requirements out there and hope that what gets measured gets managed, or the regulation needs to step in a more invasive way? Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. That's a great question. And that's probably the last one we should all come to, just because it kind of finishes off our session. Anybody else? I'm just looking for a final question. Otherwise, we're going to go straight to our answers. That's it. Great. Thank you very much, everybody. So we have the question around the many initiatives, the reporting fatigue, and how are we going to get ourselves together on this. Then we've got the issue of essentially the risks to business versus the risks to communities and workers and society, and how do we ensure that the risks to the latter are front and centre to this next iteration. Then we've got the issue of the way in which this any new directive can be part of the investor regulations that have just come out and are being developed. And finally, this issue about the transformation, the transformatory role of transparency, and how do we make sure that what is measured actually is managed and to the benefit of society. So, I will start where we ended.
Okay, maybe regarding the multitude of standards, and I think I can tie that into also the comments around the risk to people and impacts, right? There are indeed very many different initiatives that aim to set standards in the space of ESG and sustainability, but they have slightly different purposes, and sometimes very different purposes actually when you start to compare them. That's part of what was referenced as the corporate reporting dialogue conversation also. The majority of the acronyms in this space is focused on financial materiality. Yeah, it is whether you look at SASB or CDSB, and there is a focus on bringing back ESG considerations through a financial materiality lens into corporate reporting. Then there are likes of GRI. We are actually focused on at the other end of the spectrum, so the impacts on others, the impacts on society, the impacts on the environment. And I would come back in terms of resolving this conundrum, and the opportunity that is presented now by the initiative of the European Commission is actually to look at this dual materiality concept and acknowledge that there are different perspectives needed. If financial materiality was enough to figure out the issues that we're facing, we should be done already, right? Financial materiality is probably one of the most well-established concepts there are in business information provision and accounting exercise. Of course, there are always debates and about the extension of that concept, but this has been in practice and enshrined in law and in very many countries for very many years. It is distinctively also about acknowledging that there are other responsibilities where transparency is required, and they can be financial material, but they don't have to be. And I think that's the opportunity to really change corporate reporting that we have, and the acknowledgement of this in the recent work is very important. Just one more thing on the number of things corporates are faced with. I think we have to distinguish also between standard setters and guidelines providers and questionnaires. Because indeed, there are very, very many questionnaires in the space, and also very increasingly a number of for-profit providers that ask questions to fill their proprietary business information offerings. And yes, corporates are faced with all of that, and yes, it takes sometimes months to fill them in. But consolidation can also happen around that, because we're probably asking very many of the same questions. in slightly different ways, and that is actually causing a lot of the effort and the confusion in the market. Where we sit as the Global Reporting Initiative, and we've worked in occupational health and safety, we worked lately in water, and now in tax. It is possible to bring all these different groups together, including the colleagues from CDP, the colleagues from SASP, and negotiate that set that is actually core now for our perspective, impacts on others. And we could, at least hypothetically, based on these standards, do away with a lot of the repetitive questionnaire business. Yeah?
Thank you. That's great. Mirjam, please.
I think it's a very good question, and I was, basically probably waiting for this one together with Bastian and Mike on the European standards, and I'm just trying to add some things to what Bastian said. I think from our side, so CDP being a standardized based questionnaire, reporting system for companies on a specific scope, like climate and environmental issue, on both the impact information of the company on climate and environment, and also facilitating disclosures on what this means to the balance sheet, what climate change and environmental degradation means to the balance sheet of companies. We see that initiative from the Commission is quite a call for action, I guess. I think it's probably also for us to say that despite the efforts of the corporate reporting dialogue, where our organizations work together on consolidating, on sort of mapping also the data points, we probably haven't done what is expected from us to do. So I sort of agree on this is a call for action for us, and having Europe to be a leader on developing such standards is a key opportunity, I think, for CDP, and we will definitely trying to see that all the elements can be really informed by the very experts along the disclosure chain, and then CDP is probably also there and can bring in some expertise on the data on the data aggregation kind of piece of that element.
Thank you. That's great. So, Michael, let me come to you. Any answers to those questions, please?
Yes, I will answer some of the questions. I want to say just very quickly a couple of things. I agree with everything Bastian and Mirjam said. I completely agree with them. We're in agreement. It's important to recognize the materiality, the importance of this issue. We need to be clear, we need to be efficient in reporting, but we also need to look at the amount of resources we put at financial reporting, for example, and the risks associated with this. We need to be efficient, but we need to be proportionate to the risk of the issue. On the question around the various policy developments that was asked, I hope I can say this, but from my conversation with the Commission, this is actually one of the points that they are looking at. There are all these developments, there are all these connections, and I think that's an important issue that is being discussed within the Commission. The taxonomy discussions, for example, there's some requirements on disclosure, so that we need to look at that. The investor disclosure, that has some other acronym names I always forget, has also some disclosure requirements on general sort of business elements, and this is of course part of the entire sort of information chain, going from one organization to let's say the analyst, the asset manager, then to the asset owner, et cetera. And I think this will be an important, very well, it's good that you've had at this point, because we need to make sure that the information flows from one and the other, and we can actually use this, and there's policy coherence.
Thanks very much. Eleni, finally to you.
Very briefly, yes.
Yeah, very briefly.
So I will mostly tackle Dave's question, but I also wanted to make a quick point on the proliferation of different reporting standards. And clearly, sitting on this very impressive panel, our little humble reporting framework is clearly not, we're not aiming to make any strict insertions in terms of KPIs into the review of this regulation. I think that we do find ourselves, nonetheless, at a time when different stakeholders have the opportunity to come together and throw ideas around. So this is really the purpose, not so much for anyone to impose, I believe, any certain KPIs, at least from our perspective. Now, on to Dave's question. which has already kind of been tackled by Mike, clearly this has to start at the institutional level, I believe. And as Mike also said at this stage, it is really the Commission and the European supervisory authorities that need to be able to coordinate all these different efforts seamlessly. We do have a consultation that is going to come up in terms of developing indicators for the disclosure regulation, the investor disclosure regulation, in a couple of months, which is perhaps going to be a first step in which this whole alignment has to be reflected on in a concrete way. But then beyond that, and then clearly, as I said before, there are other elements developing do no harm for the disclosure regulation. How does that link to the social safeguards of the taxonomy? How does that link to indicators in the NFRD? But then there is another issue that has not really been discussed, which is the clarification of investors' duties. Because we have discussed due diligence on the corporate side, we have discussed the disclosure, the need for an alignment between what issuers are disclosing and then what investors have to disclose. But then there is another fundamental piece of work that is currently being undertaken, which consists of revisions to all the major pieces of financial regulation concerning key topics such as risk management, suitability assessments for offering products to clients, et cetera. I'm not going to start throwing a couple of acronyms such as MiFID and UCITS out there, but I think you may know what I'm talking about. Sorry, yeah, don't mean to scare you. This is a topic that really needs to be assessed in this environment as well, and we need to ensure that the review of these pieces of financial regulation do very much reflect the double materiality principle in the NFRD as well. For example, such as asking clients, retail clients, what are your interests in terms of buying a sustainability-related product? Would it just be the risk to, I'm going to use the phrase used, would it be the risk to business element and the potential returns that it may have for you? Are you interested in risk to human rights, risk to the communities, risk to the environment? I'm saying it in a very simplified way, but essentially, yes, this is the final bit of the puzzle that I think has not been discussed today, which needs to be looked at in terms of aligning.
Thanks very much. So I hope you found this session interesting. I think we've heard a tremendous richness of experience. I'd just say a few summarising points. I think, first of all, I'd love Mirjam's phrase, that we're still rather reinforcing what Sebastian said earlier, that we're still flying blind, even on the most mature end of mandatory transparency. I think we've also heard, though, that there are genuine paths to a substantial strengthening, not just for transparency in and of itself, but for the transformational effort that transparency can make when it's linked to so many of the other initiatives by the Commission that are happening at the present time, from the human rights and environmental due diligence through to the financial regulations. I think we've heard that some of that can be done through the wise use of the existing standards that are available, the Paris Accord, the ILO conventions, the United Nations Guiding Principles for Responsible Investment, for instance. I think we've also heard that there is a tremendous need to be forward-looking and think about targets, and therefore also about the way in which financial materiality and, as importantly in terms of the real economy, the sustainability reporting need to work together. I'd add, I think, and it's been said, but the global supply chain of companies is so fundamental. I mean, the International Trade Union Congress made a calculation, it must be only 18 months ago, that 97% of the workforce of the large transnationals are not employees of those transnationals. They are in their supply chains working very substantially for those companies. So the responsibility there in terms of that global supply chain and the powerful indicators that are necessary to ensure responsibility are fundamental. I think the last things I'd say are just, this issue of learning also from the best practice of companies. As we heard from the previous panel, there are companies that are way out ahead. I think we've also heard that we need that level playing field to make sure that everybody's expected to do the same, but that there is also enforcement of that. And I think that fundamental issue of enforcement is one that perhaps has been missed too many times in this work. So with that, I'll finish and just say, ask you to express your appreciation, if you would, to the panel. Thank you.